The exile order was supposed to be the end. It was delivered across every channel, every relay, every inhabited system, with a finality that left no room for interpretation. Earth was cut off. Humanity was removed. All transit permissions revoked. All trade suspended. All recognition erased with a single unanimous vote that echoed like a verdict across the stars. For the first time in recorded galactic history, an entire species had been disconnected. And for exactly 12 minutes, the galaxy believed it had worked. Because in those 12 minutes, every human signal vanished. No transmissions, no emergency broadcasts, no desperate calls for aid. The vast, chaotic noise that had once defined humanity's expansion went completely silent, as if the species itself had simply accepted its fate. That silence should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt wrong. The first anomaly appeared in a place no one was watching. A forgotten mining outpost on the edge of a dead corridor. An abandoned route that had long since collapsed into irrelevance. Registered a faint signal that did not belong there. It was not routed through any known relay. It did not pass through any recognized network. And yet, it was unmistakably human. The operator on duty almost ignored it, almost flagged it as residual noise, almost deleted it. But then the message repeated, clearer this time. We're still connected. 3 words. Calm, certain, impossible. Within seconds, the anomaly was escalated. Within minutes, it was traced. Or rather, it failed to be traced. The signal did not originate from any known coordinate. It did not follow any navigable path. It simply existed, as if it had bypassed the entire structure the galaxy relied on. And then more signals appeared, not everywhere, not loudly, but precisely. A research station hidden inside a nebula picked it up next, then a border patrol vessel drifting between jurisdictions, then a colony that had already begun preparing for isolation, expecting supply lines to collapse within days. Each one received the same message. Short, controlled, identical. We're still connected. Panic did not spread immediately. Confusion did, because according to every law, every system, every enforced protocol, this could not happen. Humanity had been removed from the network. That was the point. Inside the central command nexus of the Conclave, the anomaly reports began to stack faster than they could be processed. Analysts tried to map the signals, to locate a source, to identify a pattern, but there was none. The signals did not move through space. They appeared. Ghost transmissions? One observer suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. No, another replied, eyes locked on the data. Ghosts don't synchronize. That was the problem. Every signal, no matter how distant, no matter how isolated, arrived at the exact same moment, perfectly aligned, as if something invisible was connecting them. And then the system registered something far worse. A response, not from the Conclave, from within the signals themselves. Encrypted layers began to unfold, revealing fragments of structure beneath the simple message. Routing paths that did not exist, nodes that were not on any map, channels that bypassed every known relay without triggering a single alarm. Someone, something, had built a network the galaxy could not see, and they had been using it long before the exile was declared. The realization hit like a delayed shockwave. This wasn't a reaction. It was preparation. Deep within the command nexus, a senior strategist leaned forward, his voice quiet but edged with something dangerously close to realization. They didn't lose connection, he said. A pause. Then slower. They never depended on it. Across the galaxy, more signals lit up in the dark, threading through forgotten space, linking isolated systems with quiet precision. And in places no one thought to look, something vast began to wake, which raised a question no one was ready to answer. If humanity had already built a way to stay connected after exile, then what else had they built? Before anyone thought to stop them? The conclave did not panic. Not outwardly. It responded the way it always had. Through protocol. Through layers of control that had governed the galaxy for centuries. Emergency audits were triggered across every known relay, every sanctioned communication route, every registered node that could possibly explain the anomaly. Nothing was found. The official networks remained clean, intact, and entirely compliant with the exile order. Humanity was gone from the system, just as intended. And yet, the signals continued. They did not flood the galaxy. They did not escalate into noise. Instead, they moved with quiet precision, appearing only where they were needed, only where they would be noticed by the right observers. That alone was enough to unsettle even the most disciplined analysts, because this was not a desperate species trying to survive. This was controlled, intentional, designed. They are selecting their recipients, one data specialist said, his voice tight as he tracked the latest wave of anomalies. These are not random leaks. Every transmission is targeted. Targeted to what purpose? A senior overseer demanded. The answer did not come immediately, because the pattern was still forming. At the edge of a collapsing trade corridor, a stranded convoy received the signal just as its fuel reserves dipped below survivable limits. Minutes later, a hidden route appeared within their navigation systems, an uncharted pathway that cut through what had previously been considered impassable space. At a frontier colony preparing for supply shortages, the same message arrived, followed by updated coordinates that led to a dormant station filled with untouched resources, long abandoned, yet perfectly preserved. In each case, the outcome was the same. Crisis avoided, collapse delayed, and no explanation as to how. They are not just communicating, the analyst said slowly, the realization taking shape as more reports came in. They are guiding. The word hung in the chamber. Guiding. Without authority. Without visibility. Without permission. The conclave shifted its approach. If the signals could not be traced, then they would be forced into visibility. New directives were issued across the outer systems. Patrol fleets were redeployed, not to engage, but to observe. Trade lanes were monitored with increased scrutiny. Every anomaly, every unexplained movement, every deviation from expected patterns was flagged and tracked, and still, nothing led back to a source, because there was no movement to follow, no central hub to isolate, no signal origin to intercept. The network did not behave like a network. It behaved like presence. They are operating outside spatial routing, another analyst suggested, though even he sounded uncertain. This could be some form of quantum relay or... No, the overseer interrupted sharply. We would detect the energy cost. There would be a footprint. There wasn't. That was the problem. Whatever humanity had built did not just bypass the conclave's infrastructure. It ignored the limitations that infrastructure was based on. A new report interrupted the discussion. This one came from deeper space. A reconnaissance vessel had detected something unusual while following one of the suggested routes, something that did not appear on any official map, did not register on standard scans, but was undeniably there. At first, it looked like debris. Then the debris aligned. Then the alignment revealed structure. Not large, not obvious, but deliberate. Fragments of metallic constructs embedded within the void itself, arranged in patterns that suggested function rather than ruin. They emitted no signals, no detectable energy signatures. Yet when the vessel adjusted its trajectory, the signal strengthened. The connection became clearer. They're using hidden nodes, the analyst said, his voice tightening as the data aligned. Physical infrastructure, but concealed, designed to remain undetectable unless approached through specific vectors. How many? The overseer asked. Silence, because the answer was already forming, and no one wanted to say it aloud. Unknown, the analyst replied at last, but based on the signal distribution. He hesitated. Then, they would have needed to deploy them long before the exile. The chamber stilled, because that meant something far worse than a workaround. It meant foresight. Humanity had not waited to be cut off. They had expected it. Across multiple systems, more hidden routes began to surface. Subtle at first, then increasingly undeniable. Ships that followed them reported the same thing. Safe passage through regions previously marked as unstable, efficient navigation paths that reduced travel time beyond known limits, and occasional glimpses of structures that vanished the moment they were not approached correctly. Ghost infrastructure, invisible until needed. The Conclave was not losing control. Not yet. But it was beginning to realize something far more dangerous. It had never fully had it. Inside the command nexus, the senior strategist who had first voiced concern leaned forward again, his gaze fixed on the expanding web of anomalies now spreading across the galaxy. They didn't just build a network, he said quietly. A pause. Then, with growing certainty, they built it in the places we stopped looking. And as the data continued to unfold, another realization began to take shape beneath the first. Because the nodes were not random. They followed a pattern, a design, one that seemed to connect not just systems, but opportunities, which raised a new, far more unsettling question. If humanity had mapped the blind spots of the galaxy this precisely, then what exactly had they been preparing to do? Once those blind spots became theirs, the pattern did not spread. It revealed itself. That distinction mattered more than anyone in the Conclave wanted to admit, because what they were witnessing was not expansion in the traditional sense. No fleets were moving outward. No territory was being claimed. No flags were being planted across newly discovered systems. And yet, humanity's presence was growing. Not in visible space, but in the spaces between. Reports began to shift in tone as more vessels, both civilian and independent, started following the hidden routes. At first, it was curiosity, then necessity, then something else entirely. Reliance. A merchant convoy, once stranded and days from collapse, reappeared weeks later, not only intact, but ahead of schedule, carrying goods that should not have been accessible after the exile. When questioned, the captain offered no coordinates, no explanation, only a quiet statement that unsettled every official who heard it. We went where the map didn't exist. Another vessel returned with a similar account, though this one added something new. Not just routes, not just survival. Infrastructure. There are stations out there, the pilot said, his voice strained with the memory. Not abandoned, maintained, but hidden. You only see them if you're already on the path. How many? The interrogator asked. The pilot shook his head slowly. Enough. That answer spread faster than any signal. Enough. The word began to circulate among traders, fringe colonies, and independent operators who had long lived at the edges of conclave authority. Those who had once relied on official systems now began to look elsewhere, not out of rebellion, but out of quiet calculation, because the official routes were predictable, and predictability had limits. The hidden routes did not. Inside the conclave, the tone shifted from analysis to concern. They are creating an alternative flow, a senior logistics officer said, projecting layered trade data across the chamber. Not centralized, not controlled, but efficient. Efficiency without regulation is instability, another replied quickly. Not if it works, the first countered. That was the problem. It did work. More than that, it adapted. Routes that appeared one day would subtly shift the next, adjusting for traffic, environmental changes, even political pressure. Attempts to intercept or monitor them resulted in nothing but empty space, as if the routes themselves were aware. They are not fixed, the strategist observed, watching the patterns evolve. They are responsive. To what? someone asked. No one answered, because the answer, whatever it was, lay outside the systems they understood. A new layer of unease settled over the chamber as another report came in, this one from a neutral species known for its strict adherence to observational integrity. Their statement was simple and deeply unsettling. Human activity is not increasing, the report read. It is being revealed in phases. The strategist leaned forward slightly, his expression tightening. Clarify. A pause. Then, the structures, routes, and nodes we are detecting, they were already present. We are not witnessing construction. Another pause. We are witnessing access. The chamber went still, because that meant something far more dangerous than expansion. It meant activation. Humanity was not building in response to exile. They were unlocking something they had already built. How long? The overseer asked, his voice quieter now. How long have they had this in place? No one could answer, because every new discovery pushed the timeline further back. Years, decades, possibly longer. And that raised a question that cut deeper than any before it. If humanity had been quietly constructing an invisible infrastructure across the galaxy for that long, then what had they been expecting to happen? The first real fracture appeared not in space, but in trust. Independent systems began to quietly favor the hidden routes over official ones. Trade volumes shifted, supply chains rerouted, entire regions started stabilizing in ways the Conclave could not explain or influence. And then, something unexpected happened. A Conclave-sanctioned system, one that had strictly enforced the exile order, experienced a critical resource shortage. Under normal conditions, aid would have been dispatched immediately, but the official routes were compromised, delayed, inefficient. For the first time, the system faced a genuine risk of collapse, and before the Conclave could respond, the signal appeared. We're still connected. Moments later, a route opened. Unauthorized, unregistered, perfectly efficient. Supplies arrived within hours. Crisis resolved. The system stabilized, and the Conclave had played no role in it. Inside the chamber, the strategist exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the data that now told a story no one could ignore. They are not just surviving exile, he said quietly. A pause. Then, with a weight that settled across every mind present, they are replacing what we thought only we could provide. The implication hung there, heavy and undeniable, because this was no longer about hidden routes or ghost signals. It was about function, about necessity, about control, and somewhere beneath all of it, a new realization began to take shape. If humanity could provide what the Conclave once monopolized, then what happened next would not be determined by power. It would be determined by dependence, which raised a far more dangerous question than anything that had come before. How long before the galaxy stopped seeing exile as punishment and started seeing it as freedom? The Conclave did what it had always done when control began to slip. It tightened its grip. Emergency directives spread across the core systems with sharp precision, not as panic, but as correction. Trade restrictions intensified. Patrol fleets multiplied. Every unauthorized route was flagged as a violation. Every unexplained delivery reclassified as a breach of interstellar law. Officially, nothing had changed. Unofficially, everything had, because the more the Conclave tried to close the system, the more the system revealed its limits. Lock down the peripheral corridors, one of the overseers ordered, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had not yet learned it was being tested. If these routes exist outside our network, then we remove access to the edges entirely. The command made sense. It had always worked before, cut off the margins, and everything eventually flowed back to the center. But this time, the margins were no longer empty. Patrol fleets deployed along the outer regions, their sensors calibrated to detect even the faintest anomaly. Ships were stopped, scanned, rerouted. Entire sectors slowed under the pressure of enforced compliance. For a brief moment, it looked like control was returning. Then the routes changed. Not gradually, not predictably. Instantly, ships that had been tracked seconds earlier simply disappeared from the monitored vectors, only to reappear hours later at destinations that should have been unreachable under the lockdown. Navigation logs returned inconsistent data, showing paths that curved through space in ways that defied established mapping. "They are bypassing the blockade," a tactical officer reported, his tone tightening with each new anomaly. "Not evading, bypassing." "How?" the overseer demanded. No answer came, because there was nothing to follow. No trail, no signal, just absence and then arrival. A new report surfaced from a patrol unit stationed along a critical junction. The fleet had detected a convoy attempting to enter restricted space and moved to intercept. Standard procedure, routine enforcement, except the convoy did not resist. It complied, and still it vanished. One moment it was there, engines powered down, surrounded by conclave vessels. The next, empty space. No jump signature, no energy spike, no distortion, just gone. The patrol commander's report ended with a single line that unsettled even the most hardened officials. They didn't escape. They stopped being where we could reach them. The chamber fell into a deeper silence, because that phrasing implied something they were not prepared to confront. That space itself was no longer consistent. "They are not moving through our routes," the strategist said slowly, his gaze fixed on the accumulating data. "They are moving through something else entirely." The overseer turned sharply, to find something else. Another pause. Then, "Spaces we never mapped," the strategist replied. "Paths we never needed to understand." The realization landed harder than any loss of control, because the Conclave's power had never come from raw force. It came from knowledge, from mapping, from defining where things could and could not exist. And now, that definition was incomplete. A new directive was issued, more aggressive this time. Trace the nodes. Find the hidden infrastructure. If the routes could not be followed, then their anchors would be exposed. Recon units were dispatched with enhanced scanning arrays, sweeping through the regions where anomalies were most concentrated. Slowly, fragments began to appear. Not signals, not transmissions, but physical structures embedded within the void. Small, subtle, almost invisible. Until they were not. They're anchored to gravitational inconsistencies. One analyst reported, his voice edged with disbelief as the data resolved. "Regions we classified as unstable or irrelevant. Dead zones," another added. The strategist nodded slightly. "Not dead," he said quietly, unobserved. The distinction mattered, because it meant those spaces had never been empty. They had simply been ignored, and humanity had noticed. As more nodes were uncovered, a pattern emerged, not just of placement, but of purpose, each one connected to another, forming a lattice that stretched across the galaxy's blind spots. Not centralized, not hierarchical, adaptive, a network that did not rely on control, but on connection. And, for the first time, the Conclave understood the scale of what they were facing. This was not built quickly, the overseer said, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty. This required time, planning, coordination across multiple systems. The strategist did not look away from the data. "They had all three," he said. A silence followed. Then, "They just didn't tell us." The implication settled heavily, because it meant humanity had been operating alongside the Conclave for years, perhaps decades, without ever revealing the full extent of what they were building. And no one had noticed, not because the signs weren't there, but because no one had been looking in the right places. A new alert cut through the chamber. This one different, more immediate. A core system, one of the Conclave's most stable regions, was experiencing a sudden breakdown in supply flow, not due to attack, not due to sabotage, due to rerouting. Trade patterns had shifted overnight, diverting essential resources away from official channels and into the hidden network. Entire shipments were no longer passing through Conclave-controlled nodes. They were choosing another path. Who authorized this? The overseer demanded. No answer came, because no authorization existed. This was not a command. It was a decision, made by traders, by captains that BY systems that no longer trusted the official routes to provide what they needed. They are choosing the hidden network, the analyst said quietly. The chamber absorbed the weight of that statement. Choice, not coercion, not force. And that made it far more dangerous. Because control lost through rebellion could be reclaimed. Control lost through preference was something else entirely. The strategist exhaled slowly, his voice carrying a new edge, one not of authority, but of recognition. We are not being challenged, he said. A pause. Then, we are being replaced. The words lingered heavy and precise, and somewhere beyond the reach of every monitored system, every enforced route, every controlled node, the human network continued to grow, not by expansion, but by adoption, which raised a question the Conclave could no longer ignore. If the galaxy was already choosing humanity's system over their own, then how long before the Conclave itself had no system left to control? The collapse did not begin with war. It began with absence. For the first time in its recorded history, a core Conclave hub, an anchor point through which thousands of systems routed trade, data, and transit permissions, registered a complete and unexplainable drop in activity. Not damage, not disruption, just silence. Cargo queues vanished. Incoming fleets rerouted themselves mid-transit. Data streams that had flowed constantly for centuries simply ceased, leaving behind empty channels that should have been overflowing with activity. At first, it was dismissed as a temporary fluctuation. Then the numbers stabilized. At 0. They're not delayed, one analyst said, his voice low, almost disbelieving. They're not coming. That was when the deeper scans began. And what they revealed was far worse. The shipments had not been lost. They had not been intercepted. They had not even been diverted by force. They had chosen another route. Entire trade fleets, independent, corporate, even Conclave-aligned, had quietly shifted their navigation systems away from official pathways and into something else. Something faster. Something more reliable. Something human. No directive authorized this, the overseer said, his voice sharper now, though the certainty behind it had begun to fracture. No system should be capable of overriding registered routes at this scale. They weren't overridden, the strategist replied, watching the patterns resolve across the display. They were updated. The distinction hit harder than expected. Updated, as if the galaxy itself had accepted a better version of its own structure. A new layer of data surfaced, subtle at first, then undeniable. Human network nodes were no longer just supporting fringe systems. They were interlinking with major hubs, not directly, not openly, but functionally. A cargo route that began in Conclave space would quietly transition into an unregistered corridor, bypass entire regulatory checkpoints, and reemerge exactly where it needed to be, faster, cheaper, and without interference. They are not operating outside the system anymore, an analyst said slowly. A pause. Then, they are operating beneath it. The chamber fell silent, because that meant the Conclave's structure had not been replaced. It had been layered over, and the layer beneath was now doing the work. A new alert triggered, this one impossible to ignore. A major planetary system, one that had enforced the exile order with absolute compliance, was experiencing a cascading failure in its supply chain. Energy reserves dropping, food distribution disrupted, infrastructure beginning to strain under the sudden absence of expected deliveries. Under normal conditions, emergency protocols would have been activated immediately, but the official routes were already failing. "They are requesting aid," the communications officer said, his voice tight. "Direct appeal to the conclave." The overseer straightened. "Authorize immediate dispatch." A pause. Then the officer hesitated. "The nearest fleet cannot reach them in time," he said. "Our routes are delayed." Delayed. The word felt insufficient, because what it really meant was that the conclave, despite all its structure, all its authority, could not respond fast enough. The chamber held its breath, and then the signal appeared, not on official channels, not through authorized systems, but within the hidden network. "We're still connected." Moments later, a route opened, not mapped, not approved, but perfect. Supply vessels, human vessels, emerged along vectors that did not exist within conclave navigation systems, carrying precisely what the system needed. Not excess, not surplus, exact, calculated. Within hours, the crisis stabilized. Within a day, it was resolved. No formal request accepted, no authorization granted, no acknowledgement required. The conclave had not saved the system. Humanity had. The realization spread faster than any transmission. "They are filling the gaps," the strategist said quietly. A pause. Then, "They are becoming the system." The words settled with quiet inevitability, because this was no longer about hidden routes or clever navigation. It was about function. The conclave had always defined itself by what it provided: stability, coordination, survival across the stars. But now, those functions were being performed by something else, something that did not ask for permission, something that did not require recognition, something that worked. A new report surfaced, this one more dangerous than the rest. Internal projections. If current trends continued, if adoption of the hidden network increased at the current rate, then, within a measurable span of time, the majority of interstellar activity would no longer pass through conclave-controlled systems, not because of rebellion, not because of force, but because there was no reason to. "They don't need us anymore," one of the overseers said, the words slipping out before they could be contained. The strategist did not respond immediately, because the statement was both correct and incomplete. "They never did," he said at last. A silence followed. Then, "They just hadn't built the alternative yet." Outside the chamber, across the vast interconnected systems of the galaxy, the shift continued. Quiet, efficient, unstoppable. Routes changed, decisions shifted, dependence moved, and somewhere within the invisible lattice humanity had built, something else was happening. Something the conclave had not yet seen, because the network was no longer just responding to needs. It was beginning to anticipate them, which raised a far more unsettling question than any before it. If humanity was already replacing the system, then what would happen when they decided to redefine it entirely? The conclave did not collapse. It resisted. For the first time since the Exile Order, authority moved not through routine, but through urgency sharpened into action. Emergency assemblies were called, override permissions granted, long-restricted doctrines unlocked as the scale of the shift became impossible to ignore. Humanity was no longer an anomaly. It was a force, and forces, by conclave definition, were meant to be contained. "Full suppression protocol," the overseer ordered, his voice stripped of its earlier restraint. "All unauthorized routes are to be classified as destabilizing activity. Intercept, isolate, and terminate access." The words echoed with finality. It was not a negotiation. It was a decision. Across the galaxy, Enforcement fleets mobilized with a precision that had once defined absolute control. Strategic choke points were fortified. Border systems were sealed. Every region where anomalies had been detected was now flooded with surveillance, with the singular goal of forcing the hidden network into visibility. For a brief moment, the galaxy tightened. Traffic slowed. Independent movement hesitated. The invisible flow beneath the system faltered, not collapsing, but adjusting under pressure. "They're responding," a tactical officer reported, watching the patterns shift in real time. "Network activity is redistributing." "Good," the overseer replied. "Force them into concentration. If they cannot disperse, they become traceable." It was sound logic. It had always worked, except the redistribution did not behave as expected. Instead of converging, the activity fragmented. Routes that had once connected began to split into smaller, more numerous pathways, threading through regions that had never registered as viable transit zones. Each fragment carried less volume, less visibility, less traceable data. "They're decentralizing," the officer said, confusion threading into his voice. "Breaking the flow into smaller units." "Then we track the units," the overseer snapped. But the problem was already apparent. There were too many routes, too many nodes, too many points of connection, each one too small to isolate without committing disproportionate resources. "They're forcing us to overextend," the strategist said quietly, watching the tactical map fill with targets that multiplied faster than they could be assigned. And then something changed, not within the conclave, within the network. The signals did not disappear. They synchronized across multiple sectors. At the exact same moment, the hidden routes shifted again, not fragmenting, not dispersing, but aligning into something new, a pattern, not visible at first, but undeniable once it emerged. "They're forming corridors," the analyst said, his voice tightening as the data resolved. "High-density pathways, temporary, but structured." "For what purpose?" the overseer demanded. The answer came seconds later. Mass movement. Entire convoys, hundreds of vessels at a time, began to emerge along these corridors, moving with precision that exceeded anything the conclave had ever coordinated. Supplies, personnel, infrastructure components, all flowing through the hidden network at a scale that no longer resembled survival. This was construction. "They're not evading us anymore," the strategist said, his gaze narrowing as the pattern expanded across the display. A pause. Then, "They're building." The word landed heavily because it meant escalation, not in response to pressure, but in spite of it. "Intercept those corridors," the overseer ordered immediately. "Cut them before they stabilize." Fleets moved, vectors aligned, interception points calculated, and for the first time since the suppression protocol began, the conclave engaged the network directly. Ships entered the predicted corridors, sensors locked, weapons ready, and then nothing. The corridors collapsed, not destroyed, not disrupted, simply gone. The fleets found themselves drifting in empty space, their targets erased from existence without a trace. "They're not fixed," the officer said, his voice strained now. "They're conditional." "Conditional on what?" the overseer demanded. Silence, because the answer was not in the data. It was in the pattern. "They only exist when needed," the strategist said slowly, "and only where needed." The implication settled in with quiet force. Humanity was no longer reacting to the conclave's actions. It was operating on a different level entirely, defining its own structure, its own flow, its own rules. A new report surfaced, one that shifted the entire weight of the situation. A region previously classified as unstable, a cluster of systems long abandoned due to gravitational inconsistencies, was now registering consistent activity, not random, organized, a stable network forming where none should have been possible. "They're anchoring something," the analyst said, zooming in on the data. Permanent nodes. The overseer's gaze sharpened. Send a fleet. They already did, the strategist replied. The display shifted, and for the first time, they saw it. A structure, not hidden, not subtle, not invisible. A massive construct suspended within the unstable region, its surface alive with motion, its scale dwarfing anything the Conclave had built outside its core systems. It did not emit signals. It did not mask its presence. It simply existed, and around it, the hidden corridors converged, not as fragments, not as temporary routes, but as something unified, a hub. They've revealed it, the overseer said, his voice tightening. No, the strategist corrected, his eyes fixed on the structure. A pause. Then, they've decided it's time for us to see it. The chamber fell silent, because that meant this was not exposure. It was intention, a shift from hidden to visible, from avoidance to presence. And that changed everything. Across the galaxy, the hidden network continued to move, to adapt, to grow. But now, at its center, there was something undeniable, something human, something deliberate, something impossible to ignore. And as the Conclave stared at the structure suspended in the void, a new realization began to take shape, one that carried more weight than any loss of control. This was not a system built to survive exile. It was a system built to replace the need for one, which raised the most dangerous question yet. If humanity had now chosen to reveal its core, then what, exactly, were they about to do next? The revelation did not trigger immediate attack. That, more than anything else, unsettled the Conclave. For generations, every display of power had followed a pattern. Identify, assess, respond, dominate. The presence of a structure that large, that deliberate, that unapologetically visible, within a region once dismissed as unusable, should have demanded a military answer. Instead, it forced hesitation, because this was not a target that had appeared. It was a truth that had been revealed. Valeth stood at the center of the command nexus, his posture unchanged, but the weight behind it unmistakably different. Around him, the chamber no longer carried the rhythm of control. It carried tension, quiet, restrained, threaded through every calculation now unfolding across the displays. The structure did not move. It did not signal. It did not defend itself. It simply existed at the center of a system that was no longer invisible. That is not a station, one of the senior analysts said, his voice measured, though his gaze betrayed the scale of what he was seeing. It is not a relay. It is not even a hub in the traditional sense. Then define it, the overseer demanded. A pause. Then, it is an anchor. The word settled into the chamber with quiet weight, because an anchor did not just connect. It held. It stabilized. It defined what existed around it. And this one was human. Range, the war marshal asked, stepping forward, his presence heavy with restrained intent. The analyst adjusted the projection, expanding the visible field outward from the structure. The network did not radiate from it. It aligned to it. Hidden corridors that had once appeared scattered, fragmented, unpredictable, now revealed a deeper order. Every route, every node, every subtle connection curved, adjusted, and resolved around the anchor point as if it had always been the center. They didn't build a network, the strategist said quietly. A pause. Then, they built a system. The distinction mattered, because a network could be disrupted. A system replaced what came before it. Valeth exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the structure. Open a channel, he said. A brief hesitation followed. Then the connection formed. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the signal came. Clear, immediate, as if it had been waiting. We were expecting this stage. No distortion, no delay, just calm certainty. Valeth did not waste words. You have revealed your infrastructure. Your presence is no longer hidden. State your intent." The pause that followed was not long, but it carried weight. "Then, our intent has not changed," the voice replied. "We remain connected." The words echoed with quiet precision. Valith's eyes narrowed slightly. "You are no longer operating outside the system. You are replacing it." "No," the voice said. A pause. Then, "We are correcting it." The chamber shifted, not in noise, in understanding, because correction implied fault. "You assume authority to redefine stability," the overseer said sharply. "No," the voice replied again unchanged. "We assume responsibility where stability fails." The words landed harder than expected. Responsibility, not control, not dominance. Something more difficult to challenge. Valith stepped forward slightly, his voice tightening. "And if we do not accept your correction—" Silence. For a fraction of a moment, the structure in the void responded, not through movement, through presence. Its surface shifted, subtle but undeniable, as if the entire construct had acknowledged the question. Then the voice returned. "You already have." The chamber stilled, because the statement was not speculation. It was fact. "You are using the routes," the voice continued. "Your systems are stabilizing. Through our network, your dependencies have shifted." A pause. Then, "You crossed the threshold before you realized it existed." The realization hit like a quiet shock, because it was true. The conclave had not chosen to accept the system. It had adapted to it, gradually, unintentionally, inevitably. The war marshal's voice cut through the silence. Lower now, more controlled than before. "Then this is no longer a question of acceptance," he said. "It is a question of dominance." The response came immediately. "No." Another pause. Then, "It is a question of alignment." The word lingered. Alignment, not submission, not surrender. Something else. Valith's gaze did not waver. "And if we refuse alignment—" This time, the pause stretched, long enough to matter, long enough to feel deliberate. Then, the display shifted, not to battle formations, not to weapon systems, to data, projections, not of destruction, of collapse, supply chains failing, systems destabilizing, regions falling into disarray, not through attack, but through absence. The removal of the hidden network from the equation. "This is the alternative," the voice said quietly. The chamber absorbed the weight of it, because there was no threat in the projection, no aggression, just consequence. "You would withdraw," Valith said. "Yes, and allow collapse." A pause. Then, "We would allow your system to function without correction." The distinction cut deeper than any declaration of war, because it reframed everything. Humanity was not imposing dominance. It was offering stability, and without it, the conclave structure could not sustain itself. The war marshal exhaled slowly, his posture shifting for the first time since the revelation. Not in weakness, in recognition. "They have already won," he said quietly. No one argued, because the victory had not come through force. It had come through necessity. Valith remained still for a moment longer, the weight of the decision settling into something final. Then he spoke. "Then there is only one question left." A pause. He did not look away from the structure, from the system, from the future that had already begun to form around it. What does alignment actually mean? The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with something far more dangerous. Answer. And whatever came next would not be chosen in defiance, but in understanding. The silence that followed Valith's question did not feel like delay. It felt like wait, because for the first time since the exile, the conversation had reached its true center. Not power, not control, not even survival. Meaning, what does alignment actually mean? The words lingered, suspended between two systems that could no longer pretend they were separate. And then, the answer came, not as a declaration, not as a command, as clarity, alignment, the voice said, calm and precise, means you no longer operate in isolation from consequence. The chamber stilled, because the answer did not impose. It redefined. Valith's gaze remained fixed on the structure, but his mind moved beyond it, threading through the projections, the shifts, the quiet dependencies that had already taken root across the galaxy. Consequence, he repeated. We have always governed consequence. No, the voice replied. A pause. Then, you have delayed it. The words settled deeper than any accusation, because delay was not control, it was deferral. And now, the deferral had ended. The display shifted again, but this time it did not show collapse, nor dominance, nor even the hidden network in motion. It showed integration. Systems once separated by policy and restriction now flowed together seamlessly. Trade moved without friction. Resources reached destinations before shortages formed. Instability was identified and resolved before it could escalate into crisis. Not controlled, balanced. This is alignment, the voice continued. A system where failure is not contained, but prevented. The chamber absorbed the image in silence, because for the first time, the conclave was not looking at a threat. It was looking at a solution, and that made the decision far more difficult. Prevention removes choice, one of the overseers said, his voice measured, though uncertainty edged through it. If outcomes are stabilized before they occur, then autonomy becomes constrained. The response came without hesitation. Unstable outcomes reduce autonomy more severely. The logic was undeniable, but it did not make it comfortable. Valith stepped forward slightly, the movement subtle, but carrying the weight of decision. Then alignment is not submission, he said slowly. No, nor is it equality, he added. A pause. Then, it is interdependence. The word shifted something in the chamber. Not dominance, not replacement. Connection. And that was new. Valith exhaled, the tension in his posture easing, not in surrender, but in acceptance of a truth that had already taken shape long before this moment. You did not build this system to replace us, he said. No, you built it because you believed we would fail. A longer pause. Then, we built it because failure was probable. The honesty of the answer removed any illusion that remained. Humanity had not acted out of malice. It had acted out of expectation, and that expectation had been correct. The chamber remained still as the weight of that realization settled fully. Then Valith spoke again, his voice steady, grounded, no longer shaped by resistance. Then we align, he said. No hesitation, no condition, but not without intent. Not because we are forced, he continued, but because we recognize the system we built was incomplete. A quiet shift moved through the chamber, not outward, but internal. A recalibration of identity, of authority, of purpose. For the first time, the conclave was not defining the galaxy. It was becoming part of something larger. The human voice responded one final time. Alignment acknowledged. No triumph, no dominance, just confirmation. Outside, the massive structure remained, its presence no longer overwhelming, no longer disruptive. It had become something else, a foundation. Across the galaxy, the hidden network did not expand. It synchronized, routes aligned, systems integrated, flows stabilized, not through control, but through cooperation that had not been possible before. The conclave systems did not vanish. They adapted, layered into something stronger, something more resilient, something human. Valith turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the chamber, not as a ruler, but as a witness to a moment that would redefine everything that came after. We were never exiled, he said quietly. A pause. Then, we were redirected. The words settled with quiet finality, because that was the truth the galaxy would come to understand. Humanity had not been removed from the system. They had stepped outside it, built something better, and then opened the door for everyone else to follow. And in that moment, as the stars continued their silent motion and the network beneath them carried life, stability, and connection beyond anything that had existed before, one truth remained, unshakable and absolute. Humanity did not draw a line across the stars. They erased the lines entirely and built something no one could ever be cut out of again.